Good evening, everybody. Welcome to joining us to this webinar. My name is Janet Hueso, and I am the Executive Director here at United for a Fair Economy, who is the host organization. United for a Fair Economy has more than 25 years working and sharing our analysis around economic inequality and how is putting in risk the democracy of this country. That has been for a long time, but has been increasing in the last 30 years. We have been doing our work in a different way. When one is facilitating spaces of dialogue using popular economic education, that is our niche, how many people know us. We have been working with several groups around the country because we are a national organization. We are doing work on local and national projects, fighting for fair economy. We have three offices, one in Boston, which is the main office. We have one in Durham, North Carolina, and we have one in Minnesota, in St. Paul. We are very lucky that we have been working with around 27 organizations in the area of North Carolina. And last year in March, 2019, we introduced one of the most progressive bill raising minimum wage that right now is $7.25 an hour to $15 an hour for all workers. And what is make it very progressive is because it's including tip worker, domestic worker, farmer workers, and people with disability. That is not any other state like that. So we are very proud to do this kind of work. Also, we have one of the few programs that we organize people in the 5 top % in income. And the project is called Responsible Wealth, that the member has been doing a lot of work pushing for tax the wealthy and really providing solidarity in the work that we do. We also, like I said, popular education, we have cultural organizing, and part of the cultural organizing, we have been doing a lot of work on healing justice. So this is it in a nutshell, our work. I will need more time to explain it with more detail, but I can't wait to introduce one of a very nice person in my life, someone that I met probably around 8 years ago. He came actually to one of our training, and our methodology give us the luxury to be trainers and be trainees. And I was one of those. One of the things that I admire many things from our presenter, but one is his ability to tell stories. It's amazing. And since then, I did the click. He touched my life. And I always say to him, that is a very special for me. He's a former board member of UFE and a friend forever. So it's my honor to present Mark McDermott.
Thank you, Jeanette. It's great to be here, and thank you to everybody who's in the audience. I want to introduce my co-host, David Dixon, who works for United Fair Economy out of North Carolina. David is going to be managing the chat box, and he's going to be functioning as the eyes, ears, and voice for all of you, because we've got enough people in this webinar that there's no way in the world that we can have you asking questions directly or making comments directly through your voice. So David's going to play a critical role. David, would you like to say a couple of words before I roll this thing?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. What's going on, everybody? David Dixon, he, him pronouns, the training network coordinator for United for a Fair Economy based in Durham, North Carolina. Just want to echo what Mark said. If anybody wants to continue giving any introductions or if you want to continue any conversation, please do so in the chat. If there are any questions on the subject matter that Mark is presenting that you specifically want to ask, please use the Q&A box for that. And like Mark said, throughout this entire evening, I'll be working to summarize and synthesize all of your thoughts and bringing those up so we can uplift your voices during this time.
Great, thank you, David.
Absolutely.
I want to start tonight by honoring the tens of millions of frontline essential workers in the United States right now who are underpaid, overworked, undervalued, and most of all, underprotected. They are doing incredibly important work. Let me talk a little bit about who's in the audience, because you clearly can't see each other. We had 445 registrants from at least 28 states. There are representatives or members from 17 international unions. There's a whole bunch of supporters for United for Fair Economy, and then there's a whole bunch of people, I have no idea who you are, but we're certainly glad you're here. I want to make an offer to everybody in this webinar. Over the past 8 years, I've done 450 events across the country promoting economic, racial, and social justice, primarily but not exclusively in the labor movement. With the pandemic, 35 of my in-person events were canceled. All of the monies I've earned all these years, I've donated to progressive candidates, progressive, pro-labor, community-based organizations, and people in need. I've developed 4 new webinars that are available to be run between now and the election. I'm ready to start doing them tomorrow. This is the first one that is being rolled out the door in a big way. I waive my speaking fees and ask you to make donations to frontline organizations that are fighting against voter suppression and fighting to expand voting rights across the country. If you like what I've said tonight, I ask you to get a hold of me so that we can have a conversation and get these events scheduled and get on with the incredibly important work that we have to do between now and the elections in early November. So let me boot up my my PowerPoint. Okay, let's get started. The war on workers, coronavirus style. I ask you, which side are you on? Are you on the side of our working brothers and sisters across the country? Or are you on the side of an uncaring government? I hope that you're all on the side of our working sisters and brothers, because as I say, as I don't say, but it is being said today, work as we say, not as we do. You can work in unsafe conditions while the rich and the powerful are not in that situation. And I ask you, as we go through this webinar, to hold the people in your hearts and in your minds of the stories that I tell about them, and to remember that they truly are our sisters and brothers in the great human family that we have in our country. Dr. King, who obviously is a great American hero, once said, "The labor movement was the principal force that transformed misery and despair into hope and progress." And then he added, "The captains of industry did not lead this transformation. In fact, they resisted until they were overcome." And I'm going to tell you a story that shows that Dr. King was correct. But I would also point out that Dr. King did not say that our labor movement was perfect. At the same time, he was challenging our labor movement to address issues of racial inclusion. And so I'm not trying to paint a picture that the labor movement is always right, but I do agree with Dr. King that we were the principal force that had made things better in America. We haven't done it alone. First, we're going to look at the issue of workers and allies fighting for health and safety and food safety in unions. We're going to do a long historical look at this fairly quickly. And secondly, the war on our right to unionize and worker justice. What does that look like over the past 75 years, and what is happening today? Part 3 is fighting for health and safety at work, and particularly in the era of the pandemic. And then what are we going to do to fight forward? Because I don't want to just fight back. I want to fight forward. I want more economic justice in this country, and I want equity for all. And I hope that all of you share my point of view on those issues. So let's look at section 1. Let's get in the time machine and bang, we're going to go back to 1905. We're in Chicago. The big 5 meatpackers are called the Beef Trust. They dominate the meatpacking industry all over the country. They are powerful, they are ruthless, they are unregulated, and their industries are almost completely non-union. They force long hours, low wages, brutal conditions on their workers. They beat them down to keep the unions out. And at the same time, they're putting out substandard product that is killing many, many consumers. But there is no power that is willing to stand up to them yet. They also have a vicious racism about them. This is Philip Armour, who was called the king of the packers. Used to be Armour Meats. And I quote, "We pursue policies to keep the races and nationalities apart, stir up suspicion, rivalry, and hatred among them." There's nothing ambiguous about this. This isn't some ignorant racist from some small town somewhere. He is a corporate CEO who recognizes that if he can weaponize racism and hatred of other nationalities and hatred of immigrants, he can keep his workers divided, keep the unions out, keep his profits high, and keep the wages low and the conditions miserable. And unfortunately, all too often, Mr. Armour was right. In a 29-year period, there were 5 industry-wide strikes in the packing plants in Chicago from the late 1890s through the early 1920s. They lost all 5 strikes. National Guard was used, the police were used, they tried to starve them into submission. But one of the things that was happening repeatedly was the Germans are fighting the Italians, and the Italians are fighting the Poles, and the Poles are fighting the Jews. And the Russians are yelling at the Bulgarians. And if there are any black people around, they're going to blame it on them, say that they're the reason we're having problems. And if there's any Latinx folks around, they're going to blame them. And the divide and conquer worked well over and over and over again. And the workers were unable to learn that unity based on mutual respect was foundational if they were going to improve their lives both on the job and in their communities. At the same time, Upton Sinclair, a 26-year-old, rocks the country. He's what was called a muckraker. And I point out that he's 26 years old because today I think it is once again important for those of us who are older to be listening to young people about what do you think about what's going on in our country, and not just have the old people telling the young folks, but having a genuine dialogue back and forth. So he writes a book and he dedicates it to the working men of Chicago. Should have been the working men and working women, but the sexism of the time, he was a little blind to that. But he also said, I aim for the public's heart, and by accident, I hit him in the stomach. He wrote the book to touch the American people's hearts about the brutal working conditions, and instead they became particularly incensed by the horrific problems with food safety. So his book, which was called The Jungle, exposes these conditions. And here we have President Teddy Roosevelt, holding his nose, looking at the giant meat scandal that's going on because of poisoned meat, rotten meat, that is killing and injuring hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of consumers across the country. And in 1906, that same year, we had a huge breakthrough. We won the Food and Drug Act, which for the first time began to limit the power of big corporations in the food processing industries across the country. And the FDA stamp of approval would become an icon in American life that this food is probably safe if the FDA is doing their job. But unfortunately, we didn't win the right to unionize. We didn't win the right to safe workplaces, and the abysmal and horrific conditions continue not only in the meatpacking industry, but in industries across the country. So in a non-union America where we have no rights, we have no right to health and safety, We have no right to refuse dangerous work based on federal law. Workers are at the mercy of their employers. And in 1911, things blew up in New York City. There had been an industry-wide strike by 20,000 immigrant workers, mainly Jewish and Italian in the garment industry. And they had waged a long, bitter strike and won union recognition in dozens and dozens of garment factories in the Lower East Side in New York City. But the Triangle Shirtwaist Company would prove a hard nut to crack. The employers had refused and had pushed back against government regulation for building codes, for fire codes, for sprinkler systems, for adequate monies for the fire department, for fire engines whose ladders could reach high enough up to reach people in buildings. They didn't want to be a regulated industry, and a fire breaks out inside of the company. Well, the company had locked all of the fire escape doors because they didn't want women stealing fabric or going out and having a smoke break or talking to their boyfriend or whatever on the fire escape. And so this raging inferno starts, and the workers are trapped on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. I'm getting choked up now as I tell this story. They're trapped. There's no way out. There's thousands of people in the streets below, and they can hear the screaming. And these women start climbing out the windows. They're holding hands. Their hair is on fire. Their clothes are on fire, and they began leaping into eternity. Splat, splat, splat. They land on the street below with the fire department unable to reach them. In about an hour, 146 are dead. Many people call this a tragedy. I don't call this a tragedy. I call it a corporate massacre. It didn't need to happen if they had been regulated, but they refused regulation because they wanted to be able to do it their way. And out of this, you can see on the right, mass protests and demonstrations, and a huge movement is built in New York City and New York State. And in the years to come, almost 25 laws are passed that strengthen protections for workers both on the job in many, many ways. It is a turning point in American history. So let's go into the 1930s and the depths of the Depression. Massive unemployment. Workers are working long hours or working not at all or working very few hours but for very low pay. And there is repeated use of the National Guard and troops against strikers. You can see they're shooting Ohio strikers in Toledo, shooting them in the back as they're running away. Other places are massive strikes going on, and there is a strike up and down the West Coast of longshoremen demanding union recognition and to end the brutal systems of mistreatment and oppression that were occurring to workers. Workers are rising up across the country, and people in the communities are supporting them. I call this the great uprising of the people in the 1930s. This is one, another mass demonstration for unemployment insurance and for help. And the labor movement rises out of this, and the creation of a new part of the labor movement called the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And in 2 years, with this wave of strikes and militants like we hadn't seen in many years, the labor movement doubles in size, and then in another 8 years, triples in size. So while the labor movement is tripling in size, it also begins to change its complexion. There had been a long struggle by anti-racists within the labor movement to open up our doors and say, Black workers are our brothers and sisters. They should be a part of our movement. And in a 10-year period, the number of Black workers in the country grew from 150,000 to 1.25 million. It's a 700% increase. Our movement was never the same again. As we began to be more inclusive and say, all workers are our brothers and sisters, a turning point for the better that helped create a better future for not only Black workers, but for all workers in the country. Let's go back to the issue of health and safety. 1947, Texas City, which is near Houston, a fertilizer ship explodes. And then it spreads to the oil depots because the Houston area was the largest concentration of oil refineries and oil storage facilities anywhere in the US, and a secondary explosion. It's the largest non-nuclear explosion in US history. It stunned the people of South Texas. And what happens? They find at least 600 dead people, but there are a whole bunch of other people who have disappeared. They have no idea what happened to them. These are all human beings. These are all our sisters and brothers. They had families, they had wives, they had husbands, they had children. They're like us. Nobody knows who these people were. And so there's also a mass funeral for the unidentified dead. Sisters and brothers who are listening, I want you to get in touch with your hearts and your heads about how you feel about the fact that despite all of this havoc and all of this harm to workers, we couldn't push through legislation to mandate legal protections for workers on the job. But the movement for health and safety on the job continues to build, and by the late 1960s, one of the leading congressmen in this fight said more than 400,000 Americans had been killed at work in the last 25 years. Those are people who were killed on the job. This does not include all of the workers who died from various industrial diseases, so silicosis or black lung in the coal mines, or asbestosis from asbestos and other types of cancers. The numbers are astronomical. In fact, it's reasonable to assume that at least 1 million American workers were killed on the job in the 20th century. This is a long and bitter and difficult struggle. But in 1970, we finally won. We got the Occupational Safety and Health Act. We won the right to a safe workplace, and we won the legal right to refuse dangerous work. We could say, this work is too dangerous, I will not do it, and the employer does not have the right to retaliate against that worker for refusing to do the work. Now, it's one thing to have a law on the books, which is good. It's called the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is part of the US Department of Labor. And these rights apply to most workers in the country, but not all. But it is critically important to make sure that these rights apply equally to workers of color and to women and immigrants, as well as men and white workers and native-born workers. This is a very quick story of the long fight that we had in our country to win these sacred rights on the job. I think I've talked enough here. Why don't we take a break? And David, let me ask you, what's been coming up in the chat box? What are people thinking? What are they feeling? And are there any particular questions that I might answer here in this first discussion period? David? Your mic is muted.
There we go. Got it. Sorry about that. So just going through the chat and looking in the Q&A box, doesn't seem that we have questions to pop up just yet. But I did have, there's one that just came up. Thank you, Afton. The question that was just raised was, why is this history not taught in school? That's a great question.
Well, I would argue that the school boards, not the teachers, control what the curriculum is. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of corporate interests who want to make sure that the history that's being taught in our public schools is favorable to corporations and does not pay much attention to the struggles of workers and the struggles and their fight to have unions to make sure that they have a voice on the job. This is another form of what I would call sort of an historical cover-up. I know when I grew up, My American history classes had virtually nothing about unions at all. Didn't learn anything about it. I had to go to college to find out about it.
Absolutely. No, I would definitely echo that. Definitely echo that thought. Another question popping up here. What has been the role of National Guard in these movements? I guess when these tragedies happened, and there were declarations of states of emergencies made, how has the National Guard responded?
Well, typically the National Guard was being brought in by governors to break strikes. The National Guard and the police have been used repeatedly over the decades to break strikes and force people back to work, and to weaken the labor movement. Not in all cases, but in the vast majority of cases, the National Guard and the police have not been on the side of workers and not been on the side of workers trying to organize.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have time for a couple more here. Seeing some questions about child labor laws and the uses of children in various factories throughout history. Let's see. Also, how can unions contribute to the reorganization that we'll need to do post-pandemic and post-Trump? I think that's an amazing question.
Let me get to that in section 4. Let me touch on child labor for just a minute.
Absolutely.
My Irish grandfather went to work at age 10, went to work in a brickyard, got pulled out of 3rd grade, and worked for 65 years until he was physically unable to work and quote unquote retired at age 75 with no Social Security and no pension. My German grandfather got through 5th grade and went to work at age 12 and worked in a factory until his untimely death. Child labor was another one of the horrific labor conditions that dominated American life for decades. And it took almost 100 years from the 1840s to the 1930s before we largely banned child labor in non-agricultural industries. And that fight is still going on in agriculture. So I'm focusing in this workshop on health and safety, but child labor, you had kids working in coal mines when they were 10 years old, 120 years, getting no education so that they had no choice. So why don't we move on to the next section? And I again encourage you to be using your chat box to be sharing your thoughts, your feelings, your ideas. Is the story making sense? And do you have any specific questions that you would like to have brought out? So let's look at the war on our right to unionize and worker justice in general. So earlier I told you the story about the great uprising of workers and unions in the 1930s, where the labor movement tripled in size, and for the first time in American history, workers had a powerful labor movement. So after World War II, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was one of the 2 labor federations in the United States at the time, decided they were going to make a big push to help increase unionization in the South and help bring unions forward to improve the conditions for workers in the South. And they were viciously attacked. Relentless racism. They were red-baited, accused of being commies. They were accused of being Yankees who were coming down to wage the Second Civil War. And there was also a lot of anti-Semitism, accusing them of being Jewish, as if there was something wrong with that, which of course there's not. And at the same time, this big organizing drive was underfunded. They didn't take on the issues of race directly and as effectively as they needed to. And it eventually crumbled under relentless employer attacks. And the South remained anti-union, and it has largely remained anti-union to this day. But now I want to introduce you to one of the evil geniuses of American history that probably most of you do not know about. His name is Vance Muse. He is the founder of what is called the Right to Work movement. And he's from Texas. He says this in 1945. From now on, white women and white men will be forced into organizations with black African apes, whom they will have to call brother or lose their jobs. There's nothing ambiguous about this guy either. He is weaponizing racism. He is trying to convince white workers that black workers and other workers of color are their enemies and that they should not ally with them. And he's hoping that he can use hatred and bigotry and racism to split up the workers and in the process weaken the labor movement and to drive the unions down and out. So let's look at this right to work for just a second. During this period where you've got the CIO Operation Dixie underway, corporate America is counterattacking and pushes through what was called the Taft-Hartley Act in Congress in 1947. And they allowed states to adopt what are called right to work laws. Well, what's a right to work law? It says that, okay, a union has a contract with an employer, and the union is legally required to represent all of the employees who are covered by that union contract. Okay, but you don't have to be a union member in a right to work with a right to work law, but you're going to get all the same rights and benefits. You don't have to pay union dues or union fees, so you don't have to be a member. You don't have to pay money to the union, but you get all the rights and benefits, including if you get in trouble with the employer, the union is legally required to represent you and defend you against the employer, even though you're not a member and you don't pay any money. So it is a law that is specifically designed to encourage people to say, well, I don't need to join the union because I'm going to get the same deal anyway. And so in the process, it makes it more difficult to unionize, and it weakens our movement. And over the years, all of these states in blue have passed these right to work laws. So they're trying to move this right to work strategy all across the country. And I can assure you, in the states where right to work laws exist, the labor movement is weaker, wages are lower, working conditions are worse. It is a cancer on our society, but big business and their political allies are determined to spread it. But I got good news here. In 2018, Missouri became the first state in American history where the people voted out right to work 2-1. They said it couldn't be done, but they did it. And it shows us that if people are united, even though only 9% of the workers in Missouri are unionized, they got 2/3 of the people to say, we don't want a right to work law in our state, because union members went out and talked to their family and friends and coworkers and people in their churches or synagogues or mosques or motorcycle clubs, wherever, and said, this is not good for you. So let's look at what this war on workers and unions has meant to people in the United States. In 1983, 32% of all Black workers in the country were unionized. 1/3 of them. 37 years later, it's 11%. They've lost 2/3. For Hispanic workers, it's gone from 24 to 9, and men, it's gone from 28 to 11. So this war on workers, with the employers on the relentless attack and the courts on their side and the laws being weakened and weakened, the labor movement is shrinking. And conditions are getting worse. And I don't have to tell anybody in this audience that income inequality has skyrocketed during this period. Even though we're producing more as working people, we're not sharing fairly in the wealth that we produce. So, but let's look at some good news here. The Gallup poll, nationally recognized polling organization, asked the question, they do this every year. They ask people, are you pro-union? Just a very simple question. Do you approve of unions? 64% said yes, but young people led with 67%. So young people are the most pro-union group in the United States, even though they have less experience with unions. Okay, and women are more pro-union than men. The thing I'm pointing out here is almost 2/3 of American people, when asked the simple question, do you approve of unions? People say yes. It is broken labor laws and the relentless attacks by employers and the fear of losing your job if you stand up and say, I would like a union in my workplace. It creates fear and intimidation. So what happens in the age of the pandemic? In April of this year, with the pandemic underway, the National Labor Relations Board, which is the national governmental agency that manages elections for unions in the private sector, they announced we're going to cancel all of the elections. What? What do you mean you're going to cancel all of the elections? And so 60 unions in Washington state, and I'm sure there were many unions in other parts of the country, were hammering on the National Labor Relations Board, wait a minute, we have a right to an election. And then the National Labor Relations Board countered and said, okay, we'll allow mail ballots, elections, but the employer has to approve it. And if the employer does not approve it, then you can't have a mail ballot election. So we have the current National Labor Relations Board actively undercutting workers' efforts to try and vote in unions and giving employers the opportunity to say, you can't have mail ballot elections unless the employer says it's okay. And I would be remiss if I didn't bring up some of the injustices that President Trump has been bringing down on working people. On the left here, this is the 2016 campaign. President Trump was announcing that he was pro-LGBTQ rights. Okay, that's what he said. And 4 years later, he announces on June 12th that he wants to eliminate, he is eliminating the civil rights protections in healthcare for transgender people. Why? Because he thinks he can. And he has the audacity to announce this on the 4th anniversary of the massacre at the gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida, and in the middle of Pride Month. It's like poking people in the eye with a sharp stick. That massacre, 53 people were killed. And you use that day as the day to announce what your position is on this and to take away rights from people. Transgender people need health care. Why should they be denied? Because they're different than some of us? They're still our sisters and brothers. They're still as human as you and I. So if you haven't gone to the chat box yet and put in an idea or a feeling or a thought or a question, I urge you to do so. And I want to stop again and ask David to come back and give us a summary on, what are we hearing in the chat box? What are people feeling? What are they thinking? Are there questions that are being asked?
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the themes that I keep seeing pop up in our Q&A box are around how the labor movement is responding to racism, how it has responded to it in the past, and how it's working against that, moving forward.
Absolutely. And in the next section, I'm going to show you some very specific examples in different industries where labor is working very hard to build racial unity and try and build more worker justice and racial justice in the workplace.
All right. Absolutely.
Other thoughts or feelings that are coming up?
Yes, sir. There was one question I definitely wanted to highlight was, how can we change the negative perception of unions?
By taking one example is to take the information that I'm showing you today and telling people about it. There's a bumper sticker that says, you should thank organized labor for the weekend. Organized labor, got us child labor laws. They helped get us public education. They helped get us Social Security. They helped get us Medicare. They helped get us Medicaid. They helped get us civil rights laws. They helped get us rights for LGBTQ sisters and brothers. There are many, many issues that organized labor has worked in coalition with community groups across the country that we don't get a recognition for, and we need to do a better job in telling our own story and admitting when we've made mistakes and when we've been wrong. Because one of the ways to build greater unity is to acknowledge our own mistakes. We're not perfect.
Definitely want to bring up one more question here before you move on. Knowing that police unions have also been a part of the labor movement, how can we work with them to ensure that there's a lot of reforms in their work?
Well, this is my own personal perspective. I believe that police officers have the right to have unions, because I believe all working people should have a right to have a union. But I think it is important that the contracts that are negotiated are not written in such a way that it allows police that are acting improperly or illegally to be protected from the consequences of their actions, and that there needs to be legislation both at the state and local and perhaps national level to make sure that police officers are not only operating within the law, but they are serving and protecting everyone equally and fairly. Easier said than done, but it is a challenge that we have to step up to.
Sir.
Other questions or thoughts, or is this presentation moving people? Sort of asking the audience out there, because I can't see you. If I was speaking person to person, I could feel that, but I can't feel that.
So
Is this touching people's hearts?
Based on some of the folks in the chat and some of the questions coming up in the Q&A, I definitely believe so. There's a question here that just popped up.
Sure.
Let's see where it is. Sorry. Coming in quick. It says the highest leadership of the labor union still look like a good old boys club. What can we do about that?
Well, I think that's changing. Lee Saunders is an African American who is the head of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. They have 1.3 million members. Mary Kay Henry is a woman. She is the international president of the Service Employees Union with 2 million members. And I'm blanking on the name of the president of the American Federation of Labor, who's also a woman. More changes need to be made. More inclusion needs to occur. But it is not the all white boys club that a lot of people think it is today. Things are changing, and they need to continue to change, and for our movement to be more inclusive. And I would point out that the most heavily unionized group of people in the United States today is African American men, and that has been the case for probably the last 35 years. Something that is not well known, but is true. But we have our own work to do internally, and we should not shy away from those challenges and the hard work that we need to do. Other comments or questions before we roll on?
Let's see, there's a question here from Danielle about, do unions recruit? And also wanted to roll back to a question that was in the Q&A earlier,
Sure.
Asking if you could give any examples of successful civil suits that unions or any workers have brought forth against their employers.
Boy, I know there are a bunch, and I'm drawing a blank, so let me run that through my head for a minute. I guess I would ask that to people in the chat box, because I'm not thinking about it. I know there are a bunch. It's just nothing is immediately leaping to mind. There's certainly been fights that labor has supported around immigration in the last 20 years, and this whole fight against deporting the dreamers, as they're called, the young people who came to America at an early age and are now being threatened with mass deportation by the Trump administration. The labor movement has weighed in heavily in those suits, filing friends of the court briefs to stop that, and has done that in a number of other areas as well. You had one other question, and then we can perhaps move on to the third section.
So I believe that the other part was about union recruitment.
So there's sort of two parts to that answer. Most unions do not recruit members. That is, people get hired by an employer, and then either there is a union contract there and they become a union member by voluntarily choosing to do so. So the union didn't recruit them per se, but the union goes out and tries to encourage them to join the union in many cases. And then there are some industries like construction where you have apprenticeship programs that are jointly run by labor and management. And I've been heavily involved with this for a number of years. The unions that I know about in the construction industry are working hard at diversifying their membership, both in terms of people of color and women. Have they made progress? Yes, they have. Is there more progress that needs to be? Absolutely. But it is not, again, not what it was like decades ago. I use the phrase, we've come a long way, we have a long way to go.
You think you have time for one more question, Mark? Or
sure. Absolutely.
Bring this up. It may be a question for part 4, but it popped up in the chat and the Q&A. Let's see. How can we connect the dots between the 120,000 plus deaths in 3 months in America as a result of COVID and the income inequality and lack of health care? How is the labor movement addressing that?
Well, I would say one thing is the labor movement is one of the major forces fighting income and wealth inequality, because if you have a union, you're more likely to make decent money, get treated fairly at work, more likely to have health insurance than if you're non-union. So the existence of unions themselves are an anti-economic inequality movement, if you will. And they've also, fought hard for, universal health care, like the Affordable Care Act, and the expansion of Medicare, and Medicaid over the years, and the expansion of the social safety net, rather than the constant attacks that make it more difficult for people who are struggling to survive. And certainly they have been a major force behind trying to raise the minimum wage across the country. I mean, how in the world do people live on $7.25 an hour? That's $15,000 a year. The poverty line for a family of 4 is $28,000 a year. In Seattle, the minimum wage is about $16.50 an hour. It's $7.25 in a lot of states. How in the world do they survive? Given the cost of living in Seattle, $16.25 is tough too. But at least we have been actively working with our community allies, and in states, where the business interests dominate politically, you see the minimum wage stuck at $7.25 for literally many, many, many years. Those are poverty and starvation wages. And then they're probably not likely to have health insurance. And so the fight for universal health care is another core value that organized labor is fighting for. So why don't we move on to the next section? And of course, keep using your chat box if you will. And let's take a look at the pandemic. So here we are in this horrific pandemic, which I would argue has been horribly and deliberately and negligently mismanaged by the Trump administration and their allies across the country. And we need unions, we need a pro-worker government, and we need strong public support. So let's get right at it right now. This was a cartoon from one of the Seattle newspapers. We're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Seattle is one of the wealthiest cities in the United States. And we had healthcare workers going, does anybody have spare surgical gloves or spare masks? Like, what in the world is this? We're a modern country. And the safety net has been broken. This is a critical issue here that I want to drive home. Trump and his administration have refused to mandate legal protections for all of these frontline workers. And I'm going to show you some examples very quickly. Obama did it in 2009 in the pandemic with the H1N1 pandemic. Trump has refused to do it. So what do I mean by that? The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, their COVID-19 guidance, specifically states it is not a standard or regulation and it creates no legal obligation. So they have this guidance, but they say, the employers don't have to follow this if they don't want. And the Centers for Disease Control, which talks about masks and face shields and gloves and standing 6 feet apart with social distancing that so many of us are familiar with these days, those are all voluntary guidelines. And the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, I repeat, refuses to mandate them in the workplace, which puts workers at extreme risk. And it puts us at risk because we know those workers. Some of them are in our families. So these are conscious decisions that are being made to not protect workers in this pandemic. So in late March, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, say, hey, if you don't have any masks, if you need to, he's talking to healthcare workers, you can use a bandana. A bandana? Okay, that's one thing to be walking around the street with a bandana. I walk and see people like that, but you're a healthcare worker. You're right up close to people. And the CDC says that a bandana is not a certified personal protective equipment. They say that it's not, but they say if you don't have anything else, use that. Oh my God. What is wrong? Why don't we have these protections for workers? So let's look at the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, UFCW as they're called. I talked with leaders from their international union today and last week. They estimate that 225,000 of their members have died at work, during the pandemic. And that's their best guess. They don't know, but it is at least a reasonable low side estimate. They also estimate 29,000 of their members have tested positive or self-quarantining, awaiting results. So it's a huge number. And their international president, to his credit, speaks up and goes, these workers never signed up to be first responders. They're not police. They're not firefighters. They're not healthcare workers. They're not nursing home workers who have been professionally trained on how to manage being around infectious diseases. They're people who go to work and cut up meat or work in grocery stores. And then all of a sudden, they're on the front lines. And they don't have enough protections. And they don't have the legal rights and the legal protections that they could have if the Occupational Safety and Health Administration put their foot down with a hard hit and said, by God, these are the requirements and every employer has to comply. So let's look at frontline meatpackers, because this is one of the worst situations in the country. These are the people cutting up hogs, cattle, and chickens across the country. It's a fairly heavily unionized industry in the United Food and Commercial Workers. Over 80% of them are people of color. Over half of them are foreign born, they're immigrants. Over 80% have a high school diploma or less, and almost half of them are women. So the workers working in these meatpacking plants, this is where race and gender and immigration and worker justice all come together in a concentrated way. So President Trump has used what is called the Defense Production Act, which was passed in 1950 at the start of the Korean War, to give the U.S. Department of Agriculture the authority to force open meatpacking plants using a wartime power, okay? Even if they're not safe. And of course, there's not legal requirements about what constitutes being safe, because the administration will not order that the regulations are established. So I want to introduce you to Achu Teng. She's a Sudanese refugee who came from Equatorial Africa and fled the brutal civil war in Sudan and traveled halfway around the rural world and came to live in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. a cold place. I can't even imagine what this is like for a woman to do this. And these are her 3 sons. She's working in the Smithfield plant. They have 600, at one point they had 640 infected workers in this plant. It was almost half of all the cases in South Dakota. Almost half the cases in all of South Dakota. And Trump did not use his power to force the rapid production of personal protective equipment and ventilators. He did make General Motors produce some ventilators, but he didn't use his power to say, we're going to ramp up production very, very rapidly to make sure that all these frontline workers have the personal protective equipment, the gloves, the shields, the masks, and whatever other equipment they need. And then to make sure that the hospitals and the clinics have the equipment that they need to take care of people. He won't use his power to do that, but he will use his power to force these meatpacking plants open and put these workers like Achuteng at greater risk. And I say to everybody listening, open up your heart and try and feel what must it be like for this mother, this refugee who came to our country looking for freedom and hope and a better world. And she's forced into this situation by a government that apparently doesn't care too much about the well-being of her and her family. So let's talk about cruel hypocrisy for a minute. We hear constantly about undocumented immigrants are a threat to the United States. I personally do not believe that. I believe the vast majority of them are hardworking people, and I think there's plenty of evidence of that, who have come here to try and get a better life. And immigration reform has been stalled for a long, long time because it serves the interests of powerful corporations who want cheap labor, who live in fear. And so yesterday, the Trump administration and his allies are screaming about how dangerous all these undocumented immigrants are. Well, today, now they're essential workers and we're not going to get rid of them. Well, wait a minute. I thought they were a menace to the country yesterday, and now we can't do without them. This is hypocritical at its very core. So let's go to Storm Lake, Iowa, because this war on workers is not just taking place in big cities. It's taking place in small town America. Let's go to Storm Lake. I suspect most of you have never heard of the place. It's a small town. It's in northwest Iowa. It's out in the corn and soybean belt where there's a lot of cattle and a lot of hogs. There's 10,000 people who live in Storm Lake. Less than 40% are white, about 40% are Latinx, about 20% are Asian Pacific Islander, 4% are Black. 30% of the people who live there were born overseas. And there's 30 dialects spoken. And I use the term dialects because that is the language in the reports that I was reading about this place. And there's 3,000 meatpackers there. So Tyson is the king, is the kingpin. They dominate places like Storm Lake. And there's not a lot of places that pay halfway decent money to work. And so you're either going to work there or you may be hungry. So let's look at what the Storm Lake Times, which is the local newspaper, says about what was going on in the Tyson plant. In the month of April, there was anxiety running through the plant and running through the community about what's going on with the pandemic. What's happening here? Are we safe? What do we do? And Tyson, they didn't start testing the workers in the plant until May 18th. Well, that's 3 months after the pandemic started. Long after people knew that meatpacking plants were potential hotspots and epicenters of the virus. And you don't start for 3 months so that the workers won't know, so their families won't know, so that the community won't know, so the government won't know. Where is the justice in this? These are hardworking people doing very difficult work. They have a right to know and the right to be protected. And they've got these tight locker rooms and they're changing clothes. Look at this. They're working shoulder to shoulder. And so finally, when they start testing, In 2 weeks, the number of reported cases goes from 12 to 622. It's over 20% of all the workers in the plant. And then they're taking it out to their families, where they might be multi-generational families. Well, they were getting sick. They were sick before they were tested. And then it's spreading to their families. Do we have no compassion? Where is the compassion in this? And then to add insult to injury, the governor of Iowa says they've ordered these plants open. The companies have said they're safe, even though the federal government has not put down guidelines that specifies concretely what do you have to do to guarantee a safe workplace. If you're getting ready to go back to work and you're worried about your health and safety, if you don't go back, you can be fired. And if you get fired, then you can't draw your unemployment benefits. So I ask you, sisters and brothers, reach inside of your heart and ask the question, what would you do? What would you do if you were a single parent? Do I go back to work and maybe get infected and infect my children? Or do I say no, and I may have no income, and then what's going to happen to me? This is real life in America today, and I would argue this is profoundly unjust. And I ask all of you who are listening, do you think this is unjust? And if you do, put in the chat box, unjust. I want to hear what you have to say, because if this was a live audience, I would be putting that to you right now, and I think you would be roaring, this is wrong, wrong, wrong. So use the chat box. It's a poor substitute for direct communication, but I want to hear it. And I want David to be able to report out to us. So once again, President Perón speaks out on May 8th, and he says, the rush to reopen these plants without urgent safety improvements is a reckless move that will put American lives at risk. No kidding. And let's get down to being really real right now. UFCW Local 7, which is Colorado, one of the big plants that they represent is JBS USA, huge meatpacking plant in Greeley, Colorado. These are the 6 of the brothers who died after getting COVID, probably inside of the plant. And it may be hard for you to read, but one of them is Brother Saul Sanchez. One of them is Brother Lopez. There's Brother Dela Cruz, Brother Lee, Brother Avila, Brother Aye. I have tears in my eyes. They had probably had families, hardworking people who had dreams about a better future in America for their kids, and they're dead now. They're dead now. And if they'd had personal protective equipment and they put the regulations in place and forced these companies, some of these brothers, maybe all of them, would be alive today. How is this different than what happened in 1911 to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire workers whose employers fought the health and safety requirements of the day, and then there was a massacre? It's happening today in different ways. And we can't remain silent. We have to stand up. So President Kim Cordova from Local 7, this says 5, well, there's now 6, there's a typo there. But they opened the plant without widespread testing, similar to what was going on in Storm Lake, Iowa. And then they threatened legal action against the union for speaking up. And she says, they somehow think we don't have a constitutional right to advocate for our workers. They do have a right. We have a right. We have the freedom of speech, and we need to be speaking up, not just the union members, but their allies across the country. That's the situation in meatpacking. But it's also going on in nursing homes. Nursing homes, 42% of all the COVID deaths in the United States have taken place in nursing homes and assisted care facilities. Both of my parents died in nursing homes years ago. Hardworking people, loved them all the way out until we buried them. But only less than 1% of the population in the US. And so who's in there working? The nursing assistants, who are the backbone of these facilities, 91% female, majority are people of color, a third of them African American, and their median income is less than $20,000 a year. They're by and large primarily non-union. These are Service Employees International Union workers that are striking, and threatening a strike, saying we want more protections and we need more money to live on. So it's happening in nursing homes, it's happening in healthcare, it's happening in meat packing, it's happening in food processing. Now let's go to Yakima County, Washington, which has the highest percentage of Latinx people of any county in Washington state. It's as you can see, the darkest colored county, huge agricultural area, some meat packing, and a lot of food processing. They have the highest rate of infections from the pandemic of any county on the West Coast. Okay? No surprise. No surprise. And so the Trump administration and their allies continue to rig this system against us. The Department of Labor put a rule out that may exclude millions and millions of workers and healthcare workers and first responders from getting paid sick leave. So if you're sick and you don't have paid sick leave, you feel pressure to go to work. Well, then you're going to go to work and make other people sick and maybe make your own situation worse. And then certain businesses are not required to investigate or record the coronavirus cases, so we don't know. Don't we have a right to know as workers whether or not our lives are being threatened? This is what it looks like on the ground, sisters and brothers. We can do better. We need to stand up with our sisters and brothers in all of these industries. And there's other industries, but we only have so much time. So I've been doing quite a bit of talking here. David, why don't you come back on? What are we hearing in the chat box?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark.
Thoughts or feelings or questions?
Gosh, yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, and I definitely want to thank you again for having this conversation tonight. I think one of the main things I'm seeing, definitely a trend, is seeing the 33% of union members that still support Trump, and still support the Republican agenda that is working against unions. So one of the questions that's coming from that's been lifted up a number of times is how can we build that bridge to those that support Trump, and how can we motivate them to action, and what action specifically should we be aiming for?
Even though I strongly disagree with those union members who are supporting Trump, I know that if I call them insulting words, I will never move their hearts and minds. So figuring out a way to talk to them in ways that we can draw out of them, what are you upset about? What are you angry about? Why do you believe that the agenda of Trump and the Republican Party is good for you as a worker and good for your family? To try and get them to explain that. And I think that can help some of them see the extreme illogic of their position. Now, some of those union members are probably so racist, they want to support somebody who they believe is racist, or they may hate immigrants. There are people like that in the labor movement, because the labor movement has all kinds of people in it, because they all work in some places where you have a union. But we need to patiently talk to people and try and better understand what's causing them to support people that is not in their economic, and I would argue social well-being. Easier said than done. But some of them are also just ignorant. And when I say ignorant, I don't mean stupid. Ignorant means you lack information. And so explaining to people, why do you think it's a good thing for working people to not have a legal right to refuse work and not have access to the kind of protective personal equipment that you need to be safe on the job. Why could that be good for us as working people? That's undercutting something we fought for literally centuries. So it's how do we talk to people without turning them off or just insulting them? Because sometimes I get angry and just think you're just a blankety blankety blank and I don't want to deal with you. But that won't change anybody's hearts or minds. May feel good in the moment, but it's not an effective organizing strategy. Other thoughts or comments, feelings that are coming up?
For sure. I just wanted to kind of build on that, actually. There was a question in the chat that was asking whether or not it was purely racism that has motivated people to identify themselves with Trump, or is there something deeper? And in rolling back to your statement around how we build with people that we don't necessarily agree with, is this year an opportunity to make gains within the labor movement?
I think it's definitely an opportunity to make gains within the labor movement. It's easy for me to say that I know what is in your heart, okay? But the only way I'm really going to find out what is in your heart is if I engage with you in a dialogue. And so if I can start without having preconceived notions that you're hopeless, okay, maybe I can find ways to help, we can help people change their hearts and minds. I mean, I think about the issue of LGBTQ rights. 30 years ago, 11% of the American people were in favor of gay marriage. And today it is 2/3. So once upon a time, our gay brothers, our LGBTQ brothers and sisters were very isolated around a key issue for them. But over time, by patiently talking to people and appealing to their humanity and to their better angels, if you will, we help change the attitudes of tens of millions of people to where today, for the solid majority of the American people, 2/3 of it say, yeah, I'm in favor of that. Well, 30 years ago, it wasn't so obvious that was going to ever happen. So I use that example to say, by reaching out and keep engaging in people in conversation, we can move people. We're not going to move everybody. And I also say, children were born to love, they must be taught to hate. Okay? When a child comes out of the womb, they're not conditioned immediately to hate people. They have to learn that. And so clearly it's important for us to figure out, for the white people like me, I was poisoned by racism growing up because I grew up in a very racist, all white working class neighborhood. I didn't ask for that. But over time, I've been working on this now for 60 years. Am I carrying some of that around in me still? Yes, I am. I'm not proud of it, but it's true. But the question is what do I try and do? And so again, I say, this isn't easy, but don't write them all off.
Thank you for that. And before you move us on, I know we're getting short on time here tonight. I just wanted to lift up one more kind of two-part question here between the chat and the Q&A. And the question was, are there any similarities or examples of, or are there any similarities between the meatpacking industry and what farm workers are going through?
Yep.
And then also, can you speak to what businesses are not required to report their COVID cases?
I don't know the answer to that. I confess. I know that is the case, but I can't list the industries. Right. Agriculture is another place where historically agricultural workers, who are overwhelmingly people of color and many of them immigrants, have had lesser rights than native-born and white workers in the United States. They live in bunkhouses. They live in some cases 15 people in a bunkhouse. How in the world do you socially distance in a small bunkhouse? or you're riding in a truck out to a field. So let me move on, and let's get to some hopeful parts of this, because I don't want people to feel like there's no hope here. Dolores Huerta is one of my heroes, one of my heroines. She's a great labor leader. She's originally from California, was a farm worker leader way back in the day with Cesar Chavez. And she said, every moment is an organizing opportunity, every person a potential activist, every minute a chance to change the world. And I agree with her. Everybody we bump into, maybe we can move them to action, to stand up and to be counted and say, I won't put up with this anymore. It can be better. We don't have to accept what is being done to us. So let's look at some encouraging examples. Non-union workers at Amazon and Whole Foods and Instacart were striking over health and safety because they understand that not only are they not being paid much money, but they don't want to die. They don't want to get sickened and die. And then, of course, there's been a huge fight in the healthcare industry. And I'll go through these examples quickly. And I'm stressing fighting forward, not just fighting back. In California, they want personal protective equipment for nurses. Inadequate. Go to New York. Same story. And they're pointing out, hey, if workers are safe and they're healthy, we're less likely to get sick if we go to a healthcare facility. It's good for all of us. Go to Florida. Doing the same thing, where they're fighting for the right to safe work. So the struggle is going on in workplaces across the country, demanding that our government take action. And we have a tone-deaf administration that I argue needs to be replaced in November. So to come back to your question about farm workers, non-union farm workers in Washington state have been striking this spring, as well as in some non-union food processing plants. Because, as I said, Yakima County has the highest rate of COVID infections of any county on the West Coast. And then there was a big caravan that came from Western Washington, drove over to Eastern Washington to Yakima to support these strikes of workers, because we understand that they're our sisters and brothers, and that they produce the food that we eat, and they have the same human rights as we do. And then Kroger announced, well, we're going to have a $2 an hour hero pay. And then they decide they want to end it. Well, wait a minute, the pandemic isn't over. Why in the world is the hero pay ending? Well, because they want to. And United Food and Commercial Workers 21 here in Seattle and other places in the country are protesting, and now Kroger calls it thank you pay. Well, they're still essential. And then a big win in Chicago, this is by Service Employees International Union, nursing home workers. They threatened to strike, and they got a $15 an hour minimum wage, hazard pay, more sick days, and more adequate and protective equipment. So some victories, and people fighting forward. We need to be standing with them in this fight for justice. And I just talked with a friend of mine, Martin Rosas, who is the president of United Food and Commercial Workers Local 2 in Wichita, Kansas, who represents big packing plants. And he announced that they had just settled a new contract with Cargill, one of the biggest meatpacking plants companies in the country. They got a $2 an hour raise made permanent for 5 years, this hero pay. Then they got a $6 an hour temporary raise through August 31st, and stronger language about short-term disability pay so that they can stay off from work if they're self-quarantining or they are sick, and more help to make sure that they don't end up saddled with huge medical bills. So the fight is on, and the question is, what do we do? What do we do as people in other parts of the country? Well, Dr. King hit the nail on the head when he said the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends toward justice. I agree, Dr. King, but I and so many others humbly add, but only if we the people bend it. It doesn't happen on its own. And President Obama drove that home. It doesn't bend on its own. Our historical opportunity and task today is to stand up for justice for working people, whether they're white or people of color or male or female or straight or LGBTQ or native born or foreign born, regardless of the industry they're in, regardless of whether or not they have a union. They have the right to a union. They have a right to dignity and safety on the job. And our job is to stand with them and make sure that these rights are not only protected, but strengthened. So concretely, what do we need to do? Well, first and foremost, we got to get rid of Trump and his allies in November. This administration is completely oblivious or refuses to pay attention or take these issues seriously, except to make them worse. And we can keep hammering away on the Department of Labor and other governmental agencies and pushing our members of Congress to speak up and demand these changes. But by God, we got to put a new government in power that is pro-worker and pro-union and pro-people and pro-justice and pro-equity. Are you with me on this? If you are, put it in the chat box. We got to defend our right to vote. And this is another one of the webinars that I've put together, would love to do for your organization, because there is massive efforts of voter suppression in trying to steal this election. And we need to be on our toes everywhere. And in states where this is not a problem, we got to be supporting our allies in other states who are fighting to prevent this. We got to educate people about these issues. Okay? Because a lot of people don't know. And then we got to strengthen our right to unionize, and we got to expand our rights as workers. And key to all of this is we've got to build greater and deeper unity across issues of racial justice and class justice and gender justice and immigrant rights and LGBTQ issues, as we come together as a people and understand that we are all part of the great human family in our country and in our labor movement. We can build the power we need to take our country back. So here is the last portion. David, what's coming up in the chat box? Got any questions? And then I'll conclude with a few remarks, and then someone from United for a Fair Economy will wrap up. What's coming up? Questions or comments?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Mark. One of the things I see here is how can we share these stories of hope? I think that's definitely a huge thing, is really getting a positive narrative out to people. Then also one of the questions that I was able to jot down was that what are unions doing along the lines of GOTV?
Well, let me answer the first question, and it'll be a bit self-serving. On March 1st, I had 35 in-person speaking engagements to unions across the country. Basically, every one of them got canceled. This is a launch today of my saying to all of my union brothers and sisters across the country, I'm ready to start doing webinars tomorrow. And we've got people in this webinar from 28 states. So I'm ready to do this kind of work. Call me up. Here's my contact information. Reach out to me by email or through my, reach out to me through email, and let's get some let's get some webinars set up. But you can also educate it. This is being recorded, so at some point we're gonna release it so that it'll be out on the internet or YouTube or somewhere. Haven't figured that out yet. And unions, of course, are massively involved in get out the vote efforts. That's part of their bread and butter. And of course, it's a challenge this year because it's going to be hard to do it door to door and face to face. And so unions and other progressive organizations fighting for change are looking at ways to reach out and encourage people to stand up and make sure that they're registered, they know the issues, and they get out and vote. If you don't vote, This may continue. We can't let that happen. Other questions or thoughts or comments that have come in?
Absolutely. Want to lift this up from the Q&A. So 2 questions here. The first is, if you were the mayor of Seattle, what would you do right now to help workers and curb police brutality? And the second question, let's see, media is reporting that Trump is trailing Biden in national polls as well as polls in several, if not all, of the swing states. What do we need to do to make sure that progressive voters don't become complacent, thinking we have this in the bag and we have a repeat of 2016?
Well, let me start with the second, and then I'll come to the first one. We need to be pushing people every day relentlessly to make sure they're going to vote, and make sure that everybody they know is registered to vote and to come out to vote. It will be a catastrophe if people stay home because we have this in the bag. People died for the right to vote. We don't give it away by just going, not to worry. Can't be done. In terms of the issues of what should the mayor of Seattle do, I think that they need to look at changing the city laws about the kinds of tactics that police can use, in both crowd control, but also in arrests and how they handle various situations. I don't claim to be an expert in how police work needs to be redone. But certainly there are many cases where you probably need a social worker out working with people, as well as a police officer, or maybe a social worker goes first, because not all situations require police. And then there's going to be the negotiating of the new contract, and they need to look real hard at what kinds of behaviors are allowed, and how, and making this information more public about who has been violating either union rules or not union rules, but the union contract, or city requirements and city ordinances. It's a complicated issue, and it's going to be worked on. It's literally being worked on as we speak. Other thoughts and comments, maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then I'll wrap up, and then somebody from United for a Fair Economy can close.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. Let's see, I did see a question about churches becoming pro-union. How can we facilitate those conversations? It seems that so much of Trump's support is driven by the pulpit. And then, second question from there is, for those that are experiencing voter suppression, are unions reaching out to those individuals? Or if not, how can we lift up those voices that are having their rights stripped from them?
Second question first, and then I'll come to the one about the churches. Unions are actively working with community-based organizations across the country fighting voter suppression, because they understand that if these elections are stolen, it's bad for the labor movement, it's bad for workers, it's bad for all of us. And so I would say to anybody who's involved, who is a union member, and if you're not active, get active, be raising the question of what can our union be doing to help support our brothers and sisters in states like North Carolina, where you're from, or Georgia, or Florida, or Texas, or Pennsylvania, or Wisconsin, or Michigan, for examples of battleground states where there's voter suppression activities underway. What can we concretely do to help them? Well, one is to reach out to the people, to organizations in those states and say, how can we help? And one of the things that I've been doing is I donate my speaking fees. I just donated $1,000 from my speaking fees with the International Ironworkers Association, sent $1,000 to the North Carolina NAACP. Well, I come from a place where you put your money where your mouth is. So there was some money, and I said, well, I can't come down there and help, but here's some money. So figure out a way to contribute money. And there are other ways to help. And the churches, again, I think that not all churches are pro-Trump by any stretch. and that I grew up in a very traditional church, but we learned that Jesus stood with the poor, and stood with the poor and the down and out and the oppressed. And so I always say, if you, I'm speaking from a Christian perspective here, that we should always be standing with the poor and the oppressed and the people who were beaten down, regardless of their color, their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, who they choose to love, or whatever. So let me summarize by saying it's been a great opportunity to be here, to talk with you. And again, I say to anybody who's listening, if you think that a webinar like this could help educate, inspire, motivate, and agitate your members to get more involved, get a hold of me. Let's get these scheduled and get on with the work. And I just talked with Jeanette about the idea of doing another webinar with UFI about stealing the 2020 elections coronavirus style. So we're going to be working on that idea. So let me turn it over to Jeanette. And thank you, David, ever so much for your great work. I greatly appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank y'all for having me.
So Jeanette, would you like to close it out? And you're muted.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to. Wow, that's a very remarkable presentation. And I just want to say thank you so much to 244 people that joining us tonight from 28 states. I hope you learned a lot like I did. You know, it's a lot to process. And Mark, I have to say, I was checking the chat, and people love you and respecting you. And how not to love you? Impossible. Thank you so much for being so generous, for giving us all your skill, your knowledge, your talent. It's definitely something that we really need. So for the people that joining us, please visit us at www.faireconomy.org, where you will find out more about United for a Fair Economy. We are in the social media. Please like us in Facebook, in Instagram, follow up in Twitter. And this is just the beginning. So you will hear from us pretty soon. And yes, and pretty soon. And we will have Mark again. What a treat. What a treat to have you and learn from you. And I hope everybody stays safe, healthy. Thank you again. And let's change this. Let's work together for a fair economy. Good
And
night.
if I could just add a couple of words of praise to Jeanette. I met Jeanette 8 years ago, and I went to, I think, 3 trainings where I learned an enormous amount from her and her running partner, Steve Snap, from United for Fair Economy. And I am forever indebted, and I am a better speaker and presenter and educator because of what you taught me. So from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you. I look forward to continue working with you and United for Fair Economy. And check out their website. These people are the real deal. Thank you very much. And let's keep moving. And by God, let's win in a rout in November. Thanks much.
Thank you.